Xbox is in reset mode. That phrase matters because this story is not only about layoffs. It is about the promise Xbox made when it bought so many studios, and the pressure that shows up when that promise becomes too expensive to maintain. For years, the pitch was simple. Xbox was building a massive first-party future. More studios meant more games. More games meant stronger Game Pass value. Stronger Game Pass value meant players could trust the ecosystem for the long run. That was the dream. But now, the conversation has flipped. Microsoft published an official Xbox reset memo in June, and the language was unusually direct. Xbox leadership said the business needs both optimism and realism. They said the company expanded its studio system when it needed a pipeline of content for subscription, streaming, and devices, but that it became overextended as strategies changed. They also pointed to business pressure, hardware component pressure, and the need to reset around sustainability. Then the reporting got even heavier. The Verge reported that Microsoft is preparing major layoffs across Xbox, with possible studio closures, spin-offs, mergers, and canceled games. The studios named in reports include Compulsion Games, Double Fine, Ninja Theory, Undead Labs, and Arkane. Arkane is especially important because of the reported concern around Marvel's Blade. Compulsion matters because South of Midnight is one of the recent Xbox creative bets. Ninja Theory matters because Hellblade represents the kind of cinematic, risky, prestige game Xbox wanted in its portfolio. Double Fine matters because Psychonauts and that studio's identity represent the weird creative side of the lineup. Undead Labs matters because State of Decay is one of the long-running survival franchises players are still waiting on. That is why this story hits differently. A layoff headline is already painful. Real people lose jobs. Teams lose stability. Families get disrupted. That matters before we even talk about video games. But for players, there is another layer. These are not random companies with random projects. These are studios Microsoft acquired to make Xbox feel bigger, deeper, and more creative. So when those same studios are reportedly at risk, players hear a different message. They hear that the future they were sold may be changing, and that is the core question today. Why would Xbox spend years buying studios, then turn around and cut, sell, or potentially close some of them? The uncomfortable answer is that owning studios is expensive. Supporting studios is expensive. Waiting 5 or 6 years for a game is expensive, and if the subscription model does not grow fast enough to justify every creative bet, the math starts pushing back. That does not make the cuts painless. It just explains why the reset is happening. The old Xbox pitch was scale. The new Xbox problem is control. Can Microsoft control costs without destroying the creative variety that made Game Pass feel exciting in the first place? That is what this video is really about. Not Xbox is dead. Not every rumor is true. Not every studio is closing. The real story is that Xbox is trying to reset the cost of its gaming business, and that reset puts pressure on the exact studio pipeline that players were told to trust. The most important thing is separating confirmed reality from developing reporting. The official reality is that Xbox leadership has publicly framed the business as needing a reset. The memo says Xbox has more active partners than ever, says Game Pass started growing again after more than 8 months of decline, and says players can still expect signature exclusives every year. That is the optimistic side. But the same memo also lays out the pressure. It says the business ended the fiscal year at about a 3% accountability margin, down year over year. It says that excluding Activision Blizzard King, Xbox spent more than $20 billion over 5 years on content, platform, and hardware subsidy, while annual revenue declined by nearly $500 million. It says the studio system became overextended. That is not fan speculation. That is Xbox leadership admitting the structure is under pressure. Now add the reporting. The Verge reports that Microsoft is weighing several major moves, including potential studio closures or spin-offs, canceled games, and a wider layoff wave. The same report says Microsoft has considered canceling Marvel's Blade and selling Arkane, while also exploring outcomes for studios such as Compulsion, Double Fine, Ninja Theory, and Undead Labs. That is where source discipline matters. Reported does not mean finished. At risk does not mean closed. Discussed does not mean decided, and Obsidian is the best example of why this has to be handled carefully. Early panic put Obsidian into the same danger conversation, but Jason Schreier later said Obsidian was not in negotiations to avoid shutting down, and that Xbox is keeping the studio, according to people familiar with the situation. That correction matters, because when a story is this emotional, bad information travels fast, and the emotion makes sense. Think about the studios involved. Double Fine is not just another logo. It represents quirky, personality-driven creative games like Psychonauts. Ninja Theory is tied to Hellblade and cinematic narrative action. Compulsion just shipped South of Midnight, a game that was supposed to show Xbox could still back distinct, smaller worlds. Undead Labs carries State of Decay, one of the survival series that has been part of Xbox identity for years. Arkane carries the legacy of immersive design through Dishonored, Deathloop, Prey, and now the reported uncertainty around Blade. So when players see those names on a risk board, they are not thinking about headcount efficiency. They are thinking about taste. They are thinking about the type of games Xbox might stop making. That is why the studio list matters more than the total number. A giant publisher can survive losing a studio, but an ecosystem can lose texture. It can lose weirdness. It can lose the smaller games that made the subscription feel like discovery instead of just a warehouse for the biggest brands. This is where the Xbox acquisition promise becomes complicated. When Microsoft bought studios, the dream was that those teams would finally have stability. More funding, more security, more time, more ability to make ambitious games without fighting for survival. But if the result is that teams become part of a giant cost review, the emotional promise changes. Players start asking whether acquisition protected these studios or simply moved them into a larger machine that can cut them when the spreadsheet turns. That is why the timeline matters too. Xbox did not arrive here overnight. Microsoft spent years building the studio bench. It added teams like Ninja Theory, Compulsion, Double Fine, Undead Labs, and Obsidian, then later added Bethesda and Activision Blizzard King on top of that. The public story was not just size for the sake of size. It was that Xbox would finally have enough creators to compete with the strongest first-party ecosystems in gaming. So the reset feels like a reversal because the same scale that once looked like strength now looks like overhead. The business logic is uncomfortable, but it cannot be ignored. Game Pass needs content. That sounds simple until you think about what kind of content it needs. A subscription service cannot survive on one big game every few years. It needs regular reasons to stay subscribed. It needs variety. It needs comfort games. It needs prestige games. It needs multiplayer games. It needs single-player games. It needs surprise hits. It needs enough movement that the monthly fee feels justified. That is why buying studios made sense. If you own the studios, you own the pipeline. If you own the pipeline, you can feed the service. If you feed the service, you can keep players inside the ecosystem. But game development does not move like a streaming content calendar. A studio can take years to make one game. A creative pivot can cost millions. A delayed project can miss the window when the service needs momentum. A mid-sized studio can make something brilliant, but it can also create a game that is too expensive for its audience size. And once you own enough teams, you are not just managing games. You are managing payroll, tools, production, marketing, support, technology, leadership, and risk across an entire portfolio. That is the trap. A subscription service wants constant value. Game development creates uneven value. Some years are loaded, some years are quiet, some games explode, some games miss. Some projects need one more year. Some teams need space. But the subscriber still pays every month, and the business still has to explain why the math works. That is why studio instability connects directly to Game Pass trust. A Game Pass subscriber does not usually think about studio budgets. They think about what is coming next. They think about whether the service has enough games they care about. They think about whether first-party exclusives are still coming. They think about whether the promise is stable. So if the studios making those future games are reportedly at risk, the service feels less stable too. This does not mean Game Pass suddenly has no value. It still gets big moments. A release like Palworld reaching 1.0 can create excitement. Doom content can give players a premium reason to jump back in. Activision, Bethesda, and existing Xbox franchises still give Microsoft enormous reach, but that actually sharpens the question. Is Xbox becoming more dependent on fewer safer bets? Because that is what players are worried about. If the smaller creative teams get cut, sold, or narrowed, then Game Pass may still have content, but the flavor changes. It may become more about the safest franchises, the biggest brands, and the most predictable returns. That might make business sense. It might even make the service easier to market, but it would also weaken the discovery promise. The best version of Game Pass was not only about playing the obvious games, it was about trying the strange game, the smaller game, the creative game, the thing you would not have bought at full price. Studios like Double Fine, Compulsion, Ninja Theory, and Undead Labs represented different parts of that promise. That is why the reset feels dangerous, not because Xbox cannot survive cuts, because the cuts may define what Xbox becomes. A leaner Xbox could be stronger. A leaner Xbox could also be less interesting. There is a useful streaming comparison here. Streaming companies also learned that a subscription library can become a monster. At first, more originals look like power. Then every original needs budgets, marketing, renewals, and audience growth. If growth slows, the service starts cutting shows, pulling back on risk, and chasing the projects most likely to keep people subscribed. Game Pass is not television, but the pressure is familiar. When a service promises constant value, it has to keep proving that value. The fair counterpoint is that restructuring may be necessary. That is not the fun answer, but it is the honest one. The gaming industry overexpanded. Development costs rose, subscription strategies got more complicated, hardware costs got worse, big acquisitions created overlap, and every studio cannot be protected forever just because players love the idea of them. Microsoft is still a business. If a studio is expensive, a project is late, a game is over budget, or a strategy has changed, leadership eventually has to make choices. Those choices can be brutal, but pretending the company can fund every project forever is not realistic. There is also a version of this story where the reset leads to clearer focus. Fewer teams, better funded projects, cleaner messaging, more predictable release windows, a Game Pass library built around stronger bets instead of an overextended studio portfolio. If that happens, players may eventually get a more stable Xbox. That is the strongest defense. But the danger is what gets lost during the reset. Because games are not only output units, studios have identity. Teams build culture. Creative trust takes time. The weird game, the risky game, the emotional game, the strange little idea that becomes beloved, those things usually come from teams that need breathing room. If every studio is judged by immediate efficiency, the ecosystem becomes safer. And safer is not always better. That is why the boundary matters. We should not say every listed studio is definitely closing. We should not say every project is canceled. We should not say Xbox has failed forever. We should not ignore that Obsidian appears to be safe, or that Microsoft still owns major franchises, or that Xbox leadership is still promising exclusives. But we also should not ignore the signal. The signal is that Xbox's acquisition era has entered a cost reckoning. Players were told that buying studios would build a reliable future. Now those same players are watching reports that some studios may be cut, sold, spun off, or reshaped. That makes every future promise harder to trust. For an Xbox console owner, the question becomes whether the exclusive pipeline still feels stable. For a Game Pass subscriber, the question becomes whether the service still offers enough variety to justify the monthly cost. For a fan of Double Fine, the question is whether quirky creative games still have room. For a fan of Ninja Theory, the question is whether cinematic narrative games still have support. For a fan of Compulsion, the question is whether South of Midnight was a beginning or a warning. For a fan of Undead Labs, the question is whether State of Decay still has the future players expected. For a fan of Arkane, the question is whether Blade survives the reset. And for someone deciding whether to stay in the Xbox ecosystem, the question is simple. Does Xbox still feel like a platform building towards something, or a platform cleaning up after bets that did not work? The everyday impact is not only emotional. If you are waiting for one specific game, uncertainty changes your buying behavior. Maybe you hold off on a console. Maybe you keep Game Pass for one more month instead of a full year. Maybe you stop assuming a sequel is guaranteed. Maybe you start judging Xbox by released games instead of showcase promises. That is the trust cost. Even before a project is officially canceled, instability changes how players commit. That is the final answer. Xbox is not dead. Game Pass is not dead. And every studio rumor should not be treated as confirmed. But Xbox is clearly trying to reset the cost of its gaming business after years of expansion, changing strategies, and expensive content bets. That reset may make the company more sustainable, but it also risks weakening the creative pipeline that made players believe in Xbox's future. That is the story GamingRealm is built to explain. Not just the headline, but the system behind it. The broader game plan by Dylon ecosystem works the same way. Take messy information, organize it, and turn it into a clear story about what is actually changing. And what is changing at Xbox is not only the number of studios, it is the trust players place in the promise those studios were supposed to represent.